It is indeed an honor for me to introduce my friend, Dr. Paul Bartrop. He is a multi-award-winning scholar of the Holocaust and Genocide. He's professor of history and director of the Center for Judaic Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, Florida. In 2011-2012, as Lisa pointed out, he was the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at our Stockton. He's previously been a scholar in residence at the Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance, and Humanitarian Values at Northern Arizona University, and a visiting professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. In Australia, and when you hear him, you'll know that's where he is from. He has also taught at the University of South Australia and Monash University. His current projects are Perpetrating the Holocaust, Leaders, Enablers, and Collaborators, and Women of the French Resistance, the Rescue of Jews in Vichy France during the Holocaust. He is the author or editor of 18 books, the most recent of which, the Evian Conference of 1938 and the Jewish Refugee Crisis, The Holocaust, a Resource and Document Collection, Resisting the Holocaust, Upstanders, Partisans, and Survivors, The Bosnian Genocide, the Essential Reference Guide, and Modern Genocide, the Definitive Resource and Document Collection. In addition, he has published numerous scholarly articles in journals and books. He's been a member of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and was for many years the Australian representative on the International Committee of the Annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust and the Churches. He's a member of the editorial advisory board of the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies, a member of the advisory board of the Genocide Education Project, California, and senior consultant of the Jewish Holocaust Center in Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Bartrop is currently vice president of the Midwest Jewish Studies Association and is a past president of the Australian Association of Jewish Studies. I'm very tired, so I will sit down and hand it to Dr. Bartrop, my good friend.
Thank you, Mike. Can everybody hear me okay without me doubling up with the mic? I'm sorry, Mike. I have a suspicion that that was the presentation that was just given there. Have I done all that stuff? It's remarkable what fiction I can write. Now, you've all got your ear in to my accent. You can hear me okay now. You can understand. Mike keeps saying to me that I speak a foreign language. I speak English with an accent. So I hope that you can cut through my accent and what I'm going to be saying tonight. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. They're my glasses. Oops. The Evian Conference. Firstly, before I proceed to the Evian Conference, what a delight it is for me to be back here. As it was said, I was the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies in 2011-2012. It was my first full year living in the United States. It was the first time I learned how to drive in snow, because I come from a country, well, I come from a state which we don't have snow, and a whole bunch of other, and I learned how to drive on the wrong side of the road. Well, sorry, the opposite side of the road. So since that time, I've learned a great deal, but it started here, and now I'm back, and I'm delighted to be that way. As I was informed last night We had a number of events during the course of yesterday, and as somebody said how glad they were that I was back, and I said I just hope I wasn't letting anybody down with the presentations I was making yesterday, and the comment came, "You couldn't let us down because you are Stockton." And that made me feel so good to hear that. Yeah, okay, so let's get into where I'm at now. Everybody's got their ear in. We're all Australians now, you can all understand fluent kangaroo, so let's proceed. The Evian Conference took place in the resort town of Evian in France between July 6th and July 15th, 1938. It was an international conference that met at the invitation of US President Franklin Roosevelt with the intention of discussing in depth the nature of, now this is a case of words mattering, so listen to the words I'm saying. The intention was to discuss in depth the nature of the immigration policies of the invited nations, and in accordance with those, what the options were for accepting refugees from Nazi Germany. The countries attending were not expected in any way to depart from their existing immigration regulations. Well, a great deal would be discussed, but when the meeting's final recommendations were made, no definite action on behalf of the refugees was proposed. Only that the deliberations should continue and that a subsequent meeting should take place in London. The Royal Hotel, what a location for a gathering. We should get one of our Midwest Jewish Studies Association meetings there, I suspect. The Royal Hotel at Evian-les-Bains, nestling in the foothills of the French Alps, across from Lausanne in Switzerland, and situated on Lake Geneva, was to be the location of what was called the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees from Germany, including Austria. And that including Austria was in parentheses. The story of the conference concerns a joint global effort which had as its major objective the quest to do nothing. It was successful in achieving this fundamental aim. It enabled an exchange of information among those attending and nothing more. Contrary to what has become post-Holocaust popular wisdom, the delegates did not meet for the purpose of opening doors for refugee Jews or of forcing certain countries to ease their restrictions or of saving Jews from the Holocaust. In 1938, there was as yet no Holocaust from which Jews needed saving. There was, however, a refugee crisis. And as a consequence, the various nations of the world were confronted with a situation that has many parallels to our own time. Questions abounded. Should an open door policy be permitted for anyone claiming refugee status? Should quotas be imposed? And if so, how are the decisions to be made as to numbers and eligibility? Should refugees be permitted entry on a short-term, long-term, or permanent basis? Should refugees be allowed in regardless of the prevailing economic situation? Should refugees of a different religious or ethnic background be given the opportunity to arrive? Should they be allowed to stay, thereby potentially transforming the existing social and or ethnic and or religious fabric of the society? The issues in 1938, you can almost read today's news and see similar sorts of things. The issues in 1938, as today, were many, and the need to deal with them was urgent. Roosevelt's initiative in calling the meeting was not intended to compromise the existing policy of any country. The invitation was sent out to a number of countries, not every country in the world. The countries were selected. And the US invitation read as follows. I'd like to give you the core of the invitation. There was a lot of bureaucraties, gobbledygook around it, but the core of the invitation read as follows. If you'll indulge me for a moment while I read it to you. No, Mike, I'm not going to do it in Roosevelt voice. Thank you. Quote, the government, he's speaking about the American government, the government has become so impressed with the urgency of the problem of political refugees, note the language, political refugees, that it has inquired of a number of governments in Europe and in this hemisphere whether they would be willing to cooperate in setting up a special committee for the purpose of facilitating the emigration from Austria and presumably from Germany of political refugees. Our idea is that whereas such representatives would be designated by the governments concerned, any financing of the emergency emigration referred to would be undertaken by private organisations with the respective countries. Furthermore, here's the key, this is the bit that I've got underlined and in bold. Furthermore, it should be understood that no country would be expected or asked to receive a greater number of immigrants than is permitted by its existing legislation. Unquote. A careful analysis of the invitation reveals the following features. No particular ethnic, political or religious group should be identified with the refugee problem or the calling of the conference. Nothing should be done to interfere with the operations of existing relief bodies. All assistance for refugee work should be drawn from purely voluntary sources, and, that key bit again, no nation should be required to amend its current immigration laws to accommodate the refugees. The agenda would be set by the US government, not by an international committee or planning or interim committee. The conference, once convened, would be dominated by three men. You see them on the screen. From the left, Myron Taylor from the United States, Edward Turnauer, Lord Winterton, the Earl Winterton from Great Britain, and Henry, interestingly not Henri, but Henry with a Y, Bérenger from France. When they made their various presentations, each stated essentially that they were far from prepared to do anything that would expand Jewish refugee immigration to their respective countries. There's the happy little bunch there. The United States' position was there would be no expansion of refugee migration, only a merging of the existing quotas for Germany and Austria. No expansion, just a merging of the two existing quotas, which of course made the figure look bigger, but no change. The British position was that Britain would attend solely on the condition that there would be no discussion of Palestine, which was then part of the British Empire, British mandated territory, and that there would be no discussion of the British colonial empire. The French position was that France has already taken enough aliens, quote unquote, and that the country was saturated, quote unquote, with foreigners and was not prepared to accept any more. Those three fundamental positions then gave the lead to all other countries as they too lined up to make their presentations. When we analyse the addresses made by the delegates, it becomes apparent that they often didn't arrive with prepared instructions from their governments. All too frequently, it seemed, their statements were extemporised, as they acted safe in the knowledge that they were interpreting faithfully their government's views as they understood them. As a result, we're looking here at a gathering of representatives who were, in essence, projecting a comprehensive global perspective of official reactions to the refugee crisis caused by Nazi Germany. It's not a pretty picture. What I had to do to try to come to terms with what this all looked like was to group the various nations and their perspectives into blocks, which we'll look at in a moment. We can see a number of themes for each of them, each of these three blocks. I want to start by looking at the Europeans. They are the countries from Europe that attended. What were the common themes as each of the delegates spoke on behalf of their various... There were certain themes surmounted. There was hesitation over the possibility of supplanting or replicating the existing League of Nations High Commission for Refugees. Didn't want another organisation that the harebrained Americans were going to introduce. We've already got one, said the Europeans. That said, the Europeans held that there was a preference from them that the United States and other countries outside of Europe should step up and begin accepting a greater share of the burden. We Europeans are doing too much of that as it is. The European states expressed the view that they were only prepared to accept refugees for temporary asylum in a short-term transit capacity, and there was much sympathy expressed. But no country could, they said, play an active role in facilitating refugee resettlement. Not our problem. Or, if it is to be our problem, we only want it to be our problem for a very short while. Then we'll move them on. The Latin Americans formed the largest contingent of the nations attending. All, it's remarkable to read it, all were keen to align themselves with the call from President Roosevelt to link arms in a joint effort to ease refugee distress. All recognised that the refugee crisis was a humanitarian disaster, but all said that refugees would be admitted only in accordance with the existing laws of the land, their various countries. And what were those laws of the land? What were the preferences expressed? Only those engaged in farming would be admitted as immigrants. And no special financial arrangements would be made to assist refugee entry. Whatever migration took place would have to proceed without any detriment to local workers. And in an interesting turnabout from what the Europeans had said, that the Americans and the Latin Americans should pick up the traces of this problem, the Latin Americans said that they expect the United States and the European nations to pick up and shoulder their burden, their part of the burden, pick up the slack in solving the refugee issue. And finally it was said, nation after nation, from those countries there, nation after nation, that urban dwelling professionals and urban-based intellectuals were not wanted. So think of the demographic we're looking at, read between the lines. I won't ask you too much rhetoric to say, well, who are they talking about? It wasn't actually stated, but it's one of those things that sort of everybody knew who they meant. Which leaves us with the self-governing British dominions. Now, the British dominions were independent countries within the British Empire. Adara, they weren't colonies, were they? Oh, Canada. Go Australia. Okay. The British dominions shared a sense of being able to take charge of their own affairs without interference from Britain. In fact, it's interesting, the British government, looking through the British government archives, as the various bureaucrats were talking to each other, they were keen to distance themselves from any suggestion that they would be telling the self-governing British dominions what they should be doing. At the same time, the British Dominions, the independent British country, were saying, right on, you're not going to tell us what to do, and we're really glad that you're not thinking about it. Once invited, and they were invited because it was seen that these were the lands of recent European settlement, had vast open spaces and so forth, they informed the conference that they had neither an interest in nor a serious desire to help the resolution of the refugee problem. Canada only wanted farmers. New Zealand didn't want foreigners. South Africa didn't attend. I haven't got South Africa on the thing there, but I have got on that because South Africa didn't even attend. It was invited to do so, wasn't interested. Ireland wasn't invited, but the Irish ambassador to the League of Nations in Geneva said, "Oh, I'm going to go anyway," and so rocked up and was given a platform to be able to speak as though it had been invited. And what did the Irish delegate say? We do not see ourselves as an immigrant receiving country, so we're not going to say, that's why I'm here, is to say don't come to us because we're not an immigrant receiving country. And Australia? I'm making a feature of Australia deliberately, as you'll see in a moment, not because of the funny way I speak. Australia got to speak on the second day of the conference through its representative, the Minister for Trade and Customs, Sir Thomas White. The thrust of his speech was largely the same as the others. He drew the conference's attention to the fact that, as he said, Australia has her own particular difficulties, and that where migration plays any part in easing those difficulties, the only type which could be countenanced was British migration. Recognising the unhappy plight, that's how he put it, the unhappy plight of Jews in Germany and Austria, he said, however, quote, they've been included on a pro rata basis which we venture to think is comparable with that of any other country. Rubbish. And then he added in what somebody described, wasn't me, although I've written a book called Australia and the Holocaust, but some other commentator described as the most depressing speech at the conference, he added, under the circumstances, Australia cannot do more. And as we have no real racial problems, we're not desirous of importing one by encouraging any scheme of large-scale foreign migration, unquote. The speech continued for another few minutes, but it could easily have stopped there. One of the interesting things about Sir Thomas White and the Australian contribution was that at the Evian Conference, Sir Thomas White was the only delegate to actually mention Jews by name. All the others spoke in euphemisms, about refugees, about displaced, about persecuted people, and so forth. He actually said it for what it was. It's a Jewish issue, and we don't want Jews. One of the myths coming from the Evian, there were a number of myths coming from the Evian Conference. One of the myths coming from the conference is that while Sir Thomas White from Australia made his no real racial problems speech, that he also at the same time, this comes in the literature all the time, that he also announced a liberalisation of Australian refugee policy. Doesn't seem like much of a liberalisation in anything I just read for you, is it? The juxtaposition of these two themes is based on an entirely flawed reading of history. This is in July, keep that in mind. On December 1st, 1938, the Australian Minister for the Interior, it was the Ministry of the Interior that administered immigration policy, a man called John McEwen, announced a new policy to admit 15,000 refugees, not specifically Jewish, announced as such, not specifically Jewish, over the next 3 years. This policy had nothing to do with Evian, but was rather a response to Germany's Kristallnacht pogrom of November 9th, 10th, 3 weeks earlier. At Evian, White went out of his way to demonstrate that Australia was neither prepared to relax the immigration machinery nor to accommodate the needs of the refugees. And yet we see this, and even in government statements about immigration in the 2000s, in the current period of time, I saw a statement that said from a government publication that at the Evian Conference, Australia announced that it would accept 15,000 refugees. Whitewashing of history. Another myth coming from the Evian Conference relates to the Dominican Republic. Bring things a little bit closer to this hemisphere. It's been since held up as the only country at Evian to offer to rescue Jews. Virginio Trujillo Molina was the brother of Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. He represented the Dominican Republic at Evian. He announced that his country's Department of Agriculture could provide land, seed and technical advice, which would, he said, enable specially advantageous concessions to Austrian and German farmers with an unimpeachable record, unquote. Many commentators have since read into his speech a further declaration that was made on August 12th, 1930, over a month later, in which the same Molina communicated an offer of land for the settlement of 100,000 refugees. The two events were related, but quite distinct. Molina never said at Evian that the Dominican Republic would take 100,000 refugees. And yet in the popular mind, they've for many people become merged. The two themes have become merged. The mythology was wrong. The Dominican Republic didn't offer to take 100,000 refugees at Evian. Within what appeared to be a general confusion in the field of refugee relief activities lay a further problem. Although many spoke of a refugee crisis, as it certainly was, the various nations formed policies in accordance with their existing immigration policies and interests. Many countries didn't have a refugee policy to begin with at the outset of this period. No one could foresee the Holocaust that was to come, and thus the sense of humanitarian urgency was less pressing than it would become in later years. And herein lay a major element embedded within any assessment of the refugee problem in Europe prior to the outbreak of war in September 1939. That is, that every country in the world was formulating and administering an immigration or refugee policy, not a rescue from the Holocaust policy. It's very important that we understand that. No one holding senior office in the 1930s in any major state, including Nazi Germany, envisaged the Holocaust that would emerge within 18 months of the outbreak of war. Historians can't see round corners, and no truer claim can be made that our long-distant past was, once upon a time, someone else's far-distant future. Thus, when it came to addressing the situation at this international gathering, the only concrete proposal was to keep on talking, while at the same time not compromising the existing direction in which governments had already been heading. Now, that said, there were a number of areas in which the Evian Conference, when measured against the standards of 1938 itself, was clearly deficient. This is not hindsight history. This is putting ourselves into the skin of the people who were there at the time. There was, however, one person who saw through the rhetoric coming from the conference. Indeed, he had from the very beginning. At an official level, no one, it seems, was insightful as Adolf Hitler, who assessed the Evian Conference better than anyone else at the time. The Nazis realised that the conference was focused more on looking good than on actually doing anything of a definite and lasting nature. And the Nazis saw that it was not about saving Jews. The conference was not about saving Jews, but about saving the reputation of the attending countries. Indeed, in his closing speech at the Nuremberg Party rally in September 12th, 1938, Hitler made explicit the connection between Roosevelt's calling of the conference and Roosevelt's attempt to deflect attention away from an otherwise unhelpful American policy. One final key question needs to be asked. That is actually part of the boardroom tables at Evian. I had to take that image. I thought it was terrific because the empty chairs and it's the emptiness of the conference to me says a lot. One final key question needs to be asked. Would the Evian Conference have made a difference to the events that were to follow? Any of my students will tell you I don't like what-if questions. They're forbidden. But I'm allowing myself this indulgence right now. It's an important indulgence. And I think the best answer is only perhaps. Evian could have acted as an occasion for caring administrations to voluntarily make some kind of announcement that they would agree to an increase in their refugee or immigration intakes. However, questions of realpolitik, racial and population preferences, anti-Semitism, economic priorities, and several other factors led to a collective rejection of any liberalisation in favour of Nazi Germany's unwanted Jews. No other outcome was ever likely at this meeting, and the hopes of many were consequently both misplaced and unrealisable. Therefore, is it legitimate to refer to Evian, as many have done in light of the Holocaust, as a failed conference? I don't think so. After all, it lived up to the terms of Roosevelt's original invitation. And as a result, delegate after delegate lined up to say that what their country was doing for refugees was actually quite a lot, while at the same time demonstrating that they could do no more and were not prepared to try. The immediate results of the conference amounted to nothing of any lasting worth, which was exactly what was anticipated. The assembled countries used the opportunity presented in order to look good, but the refugees got nothing for it. This was a prime example of something that's been a term that was introduced to me just recently by another scholar. Apparently it's out there in the world, this new term, virtue signalling. I don't know whether any of you have heard that term before. A way of demonstrating, signalling if you wish, that you are highly virtuous and you are doing wonderful things without actually doing any of those things that you're seeking to make yourself look good. It's perhaps no coincidence that the word Evian, when spelled backwards, reads naive. For that's precisely what the conference was. A hope conceived and developed in innocence, in which the stakes for the Jews of Germany and then all of Europe were frighteningly high, confronting a regime that cared nothing for the standard conventions of international behaviour, and a community of states that cared little for the fate of the people they had come together to discuss. If there was any failure, I would say it was a failure of imagination, not only on the part of the countries attending, but also on the part of those hoping that some other outcome would be possible. Evian must be viewed through the lens of its initiation in March of 1938, rather than through the horrors of World War II or of the Holocaust. For me, it's therefore heartbreaking that ever since Evian, there's been a long and consistent narrative that begins with the term the failure of the Evian Conference. And yet, if its failure lay in the fact that the delegates didn't foresee Auschwitz, they weren't alone. No one in 1938 could have done so, and of course, as we know only too well now, more is the pity. After Evian, but prior to the German attack on Poland precipitating World War II, a vast number of events took place that further reduced the options for Jews to remain in Germany. These included, just think, after July of 1938, there was the establishment of a Nazi Office of Jewish Emigration to speed up the pace of Jewish migration out of Germany. That was set up by Adolf Hitler in an earlier guise. In August of that year, we saw the requirement that Jewish women add Sarah and men add Israel to their names on all legal documents. Later in August, we saw the closure of Swiss borders for Austrian Jews seeking sanctuary. In September, there was the Munich Crisis, the Munich Conference, Munich Crisis if you wish, in which Britain and France surrendered the Sudetenland regions of Czechoslovakia to Germany by negotiation. In October, there was the compulsory stamping of passports belonging to German Jews with the letter J to indicate their identity as Jews. November 9th and 10th, of course, saw the Kristallnacht pogrom throughout Germany and Austria. Into 1939, in March, we saw the German invasion of what remained of Czechoslovakia. And then in June of 1939, the return to Europe of the SS St. Louis, a ship carrying 936 Jewish passengers after being denied entry into Cuba and the United States. And that was before the war, but between Evian and the outbreak of war, when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France, as we know, declared war on Germany 2 days later. Now, while it's true that before Evian, there were no mass deportations or large-scale brutal assaults against Jews, though the immediate period after the Anschluss, the union with Austria, would certainly fall into the latter category for a brief span, 6 weeks. It's equally true that such measures began in large and increasing measure after Evian. The question has to be asked, were these in response to the nations of the world turning their back on the Jews in July 1938 at the Evian Conference? Bless you. Ascribing too much to a Nazi grand plan leading to the Holocaust is dangerous. As I said earlier, no one at Evian could anticipate what would happen next, and the policies from which the Nazis were engaging didn't necessarily foresee in a nice, clear-cut historical manner as we would read it today, foresee the events that would follow. However, there can be no escaping the fact that even in July 1938, the Jews of Germany were in desperate straits and did need help, or that the states represented at Evian displayed little other than apathy and disregard over their ultimate destiny. The years that followed Evian should have broadened humanity's horizons. How far that rings true today is for another generation to judge, but in light of Evian, they will have a template, if you like, upon which to rest their considerations. I'm conscious of the time, I'm conscious of a possibility of some Q&A, so I'd like to end this presentation with 2 quotes which, for me, exemplify the relevance of the Evian Conference for our own time. The first is from Rabbi Hugo Gryn, the survivor of the Holocaust, who later became one of the leading spiritual leaders in the United Kingdom. In his memoir from 2001, he wrote, he was channeling the Talmud in part when he wrote it, but these are his own words, "Time is short and the task is urgent. Evil is real. There is a choice." While this could certainly serve as an appropriate coda to the Evian Conference, I'd like to add something else, something which, although it's been around for a while, still rings true. Some of you may have heard it, some of you may have read it in your various courses. It still rings true, and I think no more than in the current context. It's a quote from Elie Wiesel. Some of you, as I say, might have encountered it before, but it doesn't hurt, I think, in this context to repeat it. Quote, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of beauty is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, but indifference between life and death." Unquote. And I think on that note, I'll leave it for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Right, so we have a good amount of time. Thank you very much for that presentation, and I'm sure there are questions out there. So, shall we start? Who has questions? Okay, are there any students who want to go first? Or maybe we'll get them, anyone else? Yeah.
I was just wondering, you might not know this, but I'm so interested in, now that you laid out the exact sort of stance or rhetorical stance that each group of nations took against, the Jewish refugees. Do you have some idea of how that compares to the stance those same nations are taking today, with regard to the refugee crisis?
There are times when... Hi, Christine, it's so good to see you.
Yeah, I know.
There are times when I hide behind the fact that I'm a historian who knows nothing about what's happening in the world today. Where this is concerned, I can think of one country, really, only. And that was a country that was invited to Evian but deliberately didn't go. And that was Italy. Italy, of course, as we know today, excuse me, is very much being used as a conduit for refugees to get into Europe. Many Europeans are saying that that's being abused. On the other hand, I'm going to move away from, I'll start going to teaching mode here, arms waving in the air. On the other hand, the country that was at base in this whole process, and Italy said, we don't want to take refugees, we don't want to attend your conference. This is for Mussolini's Italy. And now we've got an Italy that is the bridge into Europe from North Africa. Of course, the other country is Germany, which governments are standing or falling at the present time as a result of vast numbers of refugees being permitted into the country. And Britain, yet again, of course, is turning its back on Europe, largely as a result of ethnic problems. Perceived ethnic problems within Britain caused by the refugee issue. I'm going to add one more, if I may. Given the fact that I don't know anything about the world around me, I'm grasping at the various things I can think of, and that's my own country of Australia. Now, I don't know the extent to which people here in the audience are aware of the refugee issue relative to Australia. I was talking about this earlier on today with Professor Dickerman. who asked me straight out, what's the Australian position in regard to what's happening? And I had to say that the Australian Defence Force, we in Australia don't have a Coast Guard, so the Royal Australian Navy has had a special force that's been created as part of the Royal Australian Navy for coastal defence and coastal apprehension, there's a term, of illegal boats carrying these refugees. What happens to them? They're boarded, or they're taken into harbourage somewhere offshore from Australia, and they're placed into internment camps and forbidden from landing in Australia. We're in a situation now where in Australia, refugees are not being permitted to land, but are instead rather placed into internment camps. I got to look at my grandson, my grandchildren. My grandson's the eldest, but I can look at my granddaughters as well and say, you know, I do this stuff about the 1930s, and one day, my eldest grandson is 15. Pretty soon he's going to be saying to me, Granddad, what are you doing about it? Or worse, Granddad, maybe even better, I should say, Granddad, what should I be doing about it? It's a horrible situation that I have to report on my own country in that way. One wag in the Australian press suggested that we should build a wall around Australia. But I don't think that that's going to help Australia somewhere along the line where that sort of thing's concerned. I can't offer very much around that, apart from the fact I've been out of the country for 6.5 years for Australia's concerned. I've had my sights focused so much on this sort of stuff, I can only grasp at straws as by way of a response.
It would be a really interesting study to look country by country at
Well,
how the rhetoric is either mirroring or not mirroring, right? Like, and the extent to which, like you said, like Germany has suddenly, they made the refugee crisis in this situation, right? But I suspect that the U.S., Canada, et cetera, has very similar rhetoric to what they were using.
I think Canada's actually been pretty good around this, yeah, by contrast. Now, I want to draw your attention to my little book that was launched last week in London on the Evian Conference of 1938 and the Jewish Refugee Crisis. Of interest is the fact that this is the only book in 2017, up to 2017, this is the only book that's ever been written on the Evian Conference. There's never been a book-length study. And, of course, I was at a conference recently. Mike was there as well. And one of my former graduate students, I had a number of my former graduate students in the audience there. One of them was presenting actually on Ireland and the Irish response to the Evian Conference. And she held up my book. Very nice. Another one of my graduate students in the same audience said, because she'd been witness to me going through the process of the writing and the research and so forth, she said, Doc, it's really short. But here's the point. I've actually said in the book that this is intended to be a starting point for other studies, such as the one you're describing. Or, excuse me, or one of my young colleagues at the moment who is junior faculty where I'm located in Fort Myers, Florida, and who is doing her PhD at Gratz College in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And her dissertation, spinning off from this, relates to Jewish responses to the Evian Conference, which were dreadfully misplaced. Everybody speaks about the failure of the Evian Conference and how the Jews were let down and this and that and that. No, they just got the wrong end of the stick about what Evian was about. Nobody's really looked at what the ambitions were for this conference from those who were there at the time. You can put it slightly differently. The whole conference sucked, and that was the intention that it would. You got your hand, or you're going somewhere else.
I don't want to like take over if someone else has a question.
But do ask it here.
Okay. And then I'll. Okay, so my question, jumping off from that and from what you said, one of the first things I wrote down when you started talking is this idea of the need to be seen doing is more important than the doing, right? And then this is like a theme throughout, actually, you know, what you were saying. And I've also heard that same thing applied to things like the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, right? That this idea of being seen to do is so much more important than doing. And I'm wondering if, I mean, what's your like sort of opinion on it? It seems to me that this is sort of the, I don't know, like the sticking point for all sort of international projects, like, right? Like the UN, League of Nations, et cetera, right?
I think the best...
The being seen to be done.
This virtue signaling is something I want to pursue a little bit further. For me, what you're describing there, the best example of that was actually in Rwanda, where the film we have of that last plane flying out with white expatriates on board, and the Rwandans, whether they're Tutsi, whether they're moderate Hutu, that term, who are standing back and watching this, and they know hell begins for them straight away after that. And in the aftermath of that, when we've got various refugee camps being established, vast refugee camps in Tanzania and in what was then still called Zaire, and all the refugee organizations flooded in wanting, you know about this stuff, flooded in wanting to be seen to be doing stuff. At that time, the international community trying to make a big deal out of itself and what it could do and how it could do it. At that time, showing what they could do, rather than admitting what they didn't do several weeks earlier, which was to utilize the best possible means they could and that were available to them to stop the killing. Everybody was hiding when the killing was taking place. Now, several weeks later, they were all rushing to show what they could do and to look good for it. The people, the victims, got nothing for it. But I'm getting into the zone here of starting to rant, so let's keep it, if we can, a little bit more focused, if you wish.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Bartrop, your assessment of your characterization of the success or failure of this conference is radical relative to the long believed characterization. It was a terrible affair, etc. How did you get there? Was there a document where you went, aha? What brought you to that understanding that no one else has seen, and yet when you point it out, it's so obvious?
Thank you for the question. I don't think I had an aha moment. In fact, I know there was no aha moment, and there was no smoking gun document. I think this was just the realization of having taught this stuff for a very long time, having taught history for a very long time, and emphasizing to my students the urgent necessity of trying to get in and under the skin of people, the people that you're looking at any given period of time. Not ex post facto rationalization. I mean, people didn't know the Holocaust was going to happen in 1938. And having done a lot of work on Australian government policy and the formation of Australian government policy, I wrote a book based on my dissertation on Australia and the Holocaust. By looking at Australia, the development of Australian refugee policy from 1933 onwards, I saw a need to ask questions of the people at the time, and what were they thinking, and what were they doing about this, what they were seeing. I suppose to bring it into 2018, which we're just about there, ask the question, where do we think whatever we're looking at right now is heading? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball or look into the future or anything like that. I'm terrified of what I would find, I think. So the most we can hope to do is think, well, on the balance of probabilities, where was their thinking? And their thinking on the balance of probabilities was, this is a problem we don't want to face up to. I mean, it's amazing. People were talking in the literature at the time. Government, states, ministers of state, as well as leading bureaucrats. Bureaucrats were worse. The bureaucrats were saying, we don't want to be flooded. There's language. We don't want to be flooded with massive numbers of unassimilable aliens. Sound familiar? We're in the zone here. The fear, but it was based on ignorance. In Switzerland, the Swiss government was hedging over the acceptance of this or that child who might make it across the border, fleeing from Vichy France in 1941 or 42. And at what age do you consider a child to be? And would we let that person in and the little sister, the big sister, not in? Because we're terrified of a flood. At that time, and this is the particular situation I was describing, the number of Jewish refugees in Switzerland was calculated to be 7,000. That's not a flood of anything in population terms, unless you're, I don't know, Liechtenstein or somewhere like that. The fear of the unknown, from the people getting in under their skin. There's a lot of ignorance that was forming policy. Informing policy. And the question is, well, who are the lawmakers listening to? We were talking about that earlier today in another context. Who are they listening to? Who is informing them? And no, I think it was really a case of me developing my thinking over time, and then looking freshly at the protocol of the final report from the conference, which I replicate the final recommendations in the book, and thinking to myself, well, based on the original invitation, what did it say? The original invitation said what I read out to you. No country would be expected to do anything. What was the final recommendation? Let's do nothing. And we'll be fulfilling what we originally set out to achieve, and we'll all be happy and be seen to be doing some good. Yeah. Watch this guy. I taught him.
Thank you. Dr. Bartrop, you had said Hitler correctly assessed what the conference was about. Could you comment on how that might have affected their policy going as the war started and as the Holocaust approached in 1941 especially?
Yeah, you know, Bill, I thought about this one a lot. I thought about this actually a lot before I started working on doing my research. I'd always been of the view that what the Evian Conference represented was a statement from the nations of the world that we want no part of finding any sort of solution to Germany's problem. And that, as a result, Hitler concluded, well, therefore I'll have to make up my own final solution. That was where I'd always think, well, that's where my thinking had always gone, where that was concerned. But rather, the evolution of the war forced Hitler's hand, not what the nations of the world, of the outside world, had done or not done beforehand. As it was said at the Wannsee conference, very clearly, we inherited 600,000 Jews at the beginning of the regime in 1933. We then had to absorb another nearly 300,000 when we took over Austria 270,000 odd when we took over Austria. Now we've invaded Poland, we've had to find, and by the way, and not all of those Jews had left. Only a little over half of the Jews of Germany had left when the war broke out from 1933. And it was said at the Wannsee Conference, now we invaded Poland, we've got another 3.3 million we've got to deal with. And then we've got up to 5 million more with the invasion of the Soviet Union. So this was an evolutionary thing. By that stage, what had happened in 1938 was ancient history, as far as Hitler's thinking was concerned. And I think, again, getting in and under the skin of the principles involved, any of you seen the movie Conspiracy?
Yes.
Hands everywhere. I'd like to think it's a forest of hands.
I'm showing that to students. It's really good.
Where the character playing Reinhard Heydrich starts by saying, we have a storage problem with our Jews in 1942. So what was then, the Völkische Beobachter, the Nazi state newspaper, reported on Evian as it was happening. And its headline was, and this was telegraphed around the world, no one wants them. And that was how that was reported within Germany. That was how the Evian Conference was reported in Germany. Sure, that's going to send signals all over the place. But by the time we get into the war, that's been forgotten about. Or relegated, if not forgotten about it.
So he wouldn't even have considered other countries' response to what he was about to do when he decided that there was going to be done.
It gets us into other questions related to that, not the same questions, but related questions of what sort of actions should the Allies have taken to have stopped the Holocaust, the big debate about bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz and all that sort of stuff. And as one of my former colleagues, you'll note I said the word former colleagues, argued in a book that he wrote called The Myth of Rescue. He said there was no rescue to be had. Nobody could have rescued. He said the best way in which to stop the Holocaust was to defeat Hitler. Nothing else could have happened. Nothing else could have been done. That same professor, by the way, was one of the ones who got it wrong in relation to the Guatemala. Did I say Guatemala? Dominican Republic, and regarding Australia and the 15,000. Got it all cocked up. But his argument was nothing could have been done to save the Jews, other than what was already being done, which possibly you and I would say, well, wasn't really very much to begin with, to start off with. So awkward all round. Now, we are not yet, sure, Freudian slip, wasn't it? We are not in a war right now, in a wartime situation.
That's another question I have.
For the purpose of having to discuss a refugee issue of the potential of floods or anything like that in the wartime situation. We're still talking about what's going to happen to people right now. And people are at risk right now, all over the world in various ways. Now, I am not doing any work in relation to the current time. I don't know what the issues are in relation to refugees today, but I would say probably a very important issue would be not just the acceptance of refugees into the various countries, but the very ability to convey refugees from the country of their persecution into another country. Because one of the interesting things about refugees is that very rarely, and I say this on the basis of having studied refugee flows historically, very rarely do refugees actually want to make permanent homes in another country. They want their lives to be safeguarded. They want their persecution in their home country to stop, and then they want to go home. Wartime situation, that can't happen, of course. But right now, ask somebody from Syria what's going to happen to them, their lives in Syria. They want Syria to clear itself up so they can go home. This is their home. You've done a lot of work in relation to Kurdistan, where there are horrible situations happening. I don't know that there's a mass flight of people wanting to evacuate Kurdistan and say, I'm going to make my home somewhere else forever. Is Kurdistan their home? They want to go back, want to go home, etc., etc. I suppose I would ask the question personally, is there anything else?
I have a question of, oh, good, okay, great.
So earlier you had mentioned the quote about indifference, and I was just wondering, like, I know that in years past or in past moments, many forces don't get involved in a conflict unless, you know, it serves their interests. So the U.S. didn't get involved in World War II until the attack on Pearl Harbor. And weren't really concerned about the welfare of the Jewish people, but because, you know, Americans were killed in the attack. So I was just wondering, in your opinion, do you believe that mentality of not just indifference and apathy, but serving your best interests is like a detriment, or as far as, you know, because that a lot of people consider that to be a slippery slope, whereas, you know, should we help other people and aid refugees when we have problems in our own country? So I was wondering what you thought about that.
There are actually two things you've raised there. I'll deal with the last one you raised, then I'll get on to international behaviours. The indifference quote that I mentioned came from Elie Wiesel. At another time, he said something else, which I've actually embedded into the vision statement for the centre that I run at Florida Gulf Coast University, in which he made the statement, how can I expect, he says, how can I expect to have compassion for the world if I have none for the person who sits next to me? We all need each other, ultimately. But unfortunately, this gets to the other thing that you raised. States, in interstate behaviour, states are not moral. States are neither moral nor immoral. States are amoral. States don't have friends. States have interests. States are not people. They don't see things in terms of morality, of what's good or what's bad, what's right or what's wrong. They see things in terms of what's safe or what's dangerous. With that in mind, and you kind of complicate that by putting governments in charge of states. Because governments, particularly in democracies, want to stay in good. They want to stay in power. Dictatorships are very different in that regard. So until such time as there is some sort of realization that, and I don't know it's going to happen in my lifetime, that there is actually something else, some higher sort of level of obligation that we should consider, I've got to stay pessimistic around that. So where do I see, and this gets us into why we're here in one sense tonight, and why you're here, and why many of you are doing these courses. How is any of this going to be stopped? How are we going to make the world a genocide-free world? I personally think it's a generational thing. I foresee the prospect of education playing a role into the future. Generationally. You know, since 1945, with the end of the war, there has been more international human rights legislation, or what could be described as human rights legislation internationally, than all of recorded history leading up to 1945. And yet, since 1945, just off the top of my head, we've had genocides taking place in Biafra, in Burundi, well, I'm not going to put them in order, but in Rwanda, in Darfur, in southern Sudan, in Bosnia, in right now in Myanmar. You name it, you've got a wide variety of other things. So corresponding to international legislation to stop all of this, we've had the massive upsurge since 1945, and it's still with us. I would clear away. If I was in, it's good to be the king. If I was the king, I would do away with existing ways of operating internationally and start with some sort of moral plane. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because it can't happen. Because it doesn't operate that way so long as we live in a system of states. Yeah? You can make the difference. We can each make a difference. I like to speak in terms of the ripple effect. I can't change the world. I can only change my little corner of it. But if I can change my little corner of it, and you're going to do the same thing, and your efforts and my efforts, like a ripple effect, can link up over time, then maybe there's some sort of hope. It's got to start with a consciousness, an awareness of why things have got to change, why things have got to be better. There's an awful lot of ignorance out there, guys. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of work to do. And it continues. And that's starting to be, give the rabbi a pulpit, give the pastor his opportunity and he'll go for it. That's what I'm doing right now. I don't mean to preach. I'm sorry.
No, thank you so much. This is so important. I have a couple questions, but I'll limit them because we don't have much time. I want to ask, however, one more question. I think it's very important that you point out that these things happen again and again. Every current genocide has its Evian Conference in a way beforehand. People don't see the future, but at some point we have to hold people accountable for seeing enough, right? That they understand something has to be done. I'm wondering, did you find in your reading of all this documentation, since you're the only one who's written a book on this subject, did you find any dissenting voices? Do you know, even somebody who's writing a memo or a clerk, right, at the lower levels of the bureaucracy, anybody who seemed to dissent from the purpose of this meeting, which was a type of virtue signaling meant to rescue the reputations of the states at the time?
Great question. Sadly, no.
No.
In fact, the internal memos of the various bureaucrats, I mentioned the bureaucrats before, but I didn't expound upon that, were in some instances really brutal in relation to the refugees. The best, no, it's actually the worst, was from a British civil servant who actually wrote, minuted by hand on a document dealing with this very issue. In my opinion, a disproportionate amount of time is wasted by this department on these wailing Jews. Yeah. And of course, okay, policy is a response to a challenge. He's not writing for posterity. He's not writing for what historians like me are going to pick up. He's given it from the guts. And that's what he's saying. And this is why bureaucrats, civil servants who have gone through courses like what we have here might be a little bit more sensitized.
Exactly.
That's my hope.
It shows how important it is to speak up no matter where you are, right? To speak up when you see injustice happening. Anyway, thank you. That's a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Bartrop. Thank you.